Evening at dusk. The Californian sun was bleeding, its last orange and purple hues over. The quiet suburb of Cedar Brook. Inside her modest two-story house on Maple Lane, Helen Rivers was performing her evening ritual. The clink of a single ceramic mug, the hiss of the kettle, the slow, deliberate pouring of boiling water over a Lipton. Teabag, it was a symphony of solitude. Each movement a note in the elegy of her waiting. 12 years, 4,383 days. The math was etched behind her eyes, a constant, painful calculation. Her son, Adam Rivers, had vanished on his way to a conference in Chicago. One moment he was a vibrant, 30-year-old architect with a laugh that could fill a room. The next he was a case number, a blurred photograph on a missing persons flyer, a ghost who had left no trace. Today was his birthday. He would have been 42. "Happy birthday, my boy," she whispered to the empty living room, her voice a dry rustle. The room was a museum to his memory. His high school graduation photo, his college degree in a frame, a clumsy clay pot he'd made in 3rd grade, all perfectly preserved, dusted daily with a devotion that bordered on prayer. A knock on the front door, firm and official, shattered the silence. It was too late for visitors. Rose, her kindly neighbor, always called first. With a slight tremor in her step, Helen walked to the door and opened it. A uniformed USPS delivery man stood there, his face etched with an unusual mix of apology and curiosity. In his gloved hand, he held not a modern package, but a standard legal-sized envelope. It was a sickly, faded yellow, stained with dark, muddy blotches and what looked like the ghost of a water ring. The address was handwritten, the ink smudged and blurred in places, as if it had been caught in a rainstorm long ago. "Mrs. Helen Rivers?" he asked softly. I need you to sign for this. It's a special delivery. We found it during the renovation of the old downtown processing center. It was stuck behind a sorting machine. The postmark, it's from 12 years ago, June 12th. Helen's breath hitched. Time seemed to slow, the crickets outside fading into a dull hum. She knew that date. It was the day after Adam had disappeared. The day she had written him a desperate letter asking him to come home, promising they could fix whatever had gone wrong. She had mailed it to his old apartment, a place he hadn't lived in for years. Her hand, suddenly numb, reached out and took the envelope. It felt heavy, not with physical weight, but with the gravity of 12 lost years. "Thank you," she whispered. She closed the door and leaned against it, her heart hammering like a trapped bird. The silence in the house felt different now, charged alive, terrifying. She carried the envelope to the kitchen table, her sanctuary, where she had spent countless hours staring at the phone. Willing it to ring, she laid the envelope down as if it were a sacred relic. The glue was brittle with age. Using the bone-handled letter opener her late husband Gerald Rivers had loved, she carefully slid it open. Her hands trembled violently as she pulled out the contents. It wasn't her letter. A photograph slid out first. A wedding photo her Adam looking handsome and young in a simple black suit, a radiant smile on his face that reached his kind, familiar eyes. His arm was wrapped around a woman in a white dress. But something was odd. The picture was slightly out of focus, and the bride's face was turned just enough, her veil masking her features. Only her eyes were perfectly clear. Deep, intelligent, soulful brown eyes, filled with a love that seemed to leap from the faded paper. And Helen knew those eyes. They were the same. Eyes that had looked into hers just yesterday, the young woman who had appeared at her doorstep with a small, shy boy hiding behind her legs. She had introduced herself as Sarah Miller. She had said she was an old friend of Adam's, just passing through town. But her gaze had held a strange intensity, a silent plea Helen hadn't understood until now. Beneath the photo was a single sheet of paper, not the one she had written. This one was written in Adam's handwriting. The slanted script she would have recognized anywhere. 3 words, simple, terrifying. "She is with you now?" Helen stared until the words blurred. Air left her lungs in a slow, painful sigh. This wasn't a letter from the past. It was a key from the shadows sent by her son. And Sarah, with those unforgettable eyes, was holding the other half of the lock. The waiting was over. A different, more frightening journey was about to begin. The knock on the hotel door. The yellowed envelope felt like a live wire in Helen's hands. She didn't remember driving to the Cedar Brook Inn. The world had blurred into a haze of streetlights and fragmented memories. Adam's first bike, His college graduation, the last time he hugged her, his voice a warm promise. "I'll see you Sunday, Mom." Now standing in the cool evening air outside room 214, every one of those memories felt like a shard of glass in her heart. The photograph in her hand, Adam, so young, so alive with that woman, Sarah, was both a blessing and a curse. It proved he had lived, loved, and kept secrets. Big ones. She knocked, her knuckles striking the wood with a force that surprised her. The door opened slowly. Sarah Miller stood there, her face pale under the harsh fluorescent light. She wore simple pajamas, and her deep brown eyes, the same ones from the photograph, widened in shock, then filled with a weary resignation. She'd been expecting this someday. "Mrs. Rivers," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. "You knew," Helen said, her own voice rough with unshed tears. She didn't phrase it as a question. She thrust the envelope toward Sarah. "You knew about this. You were there. Who are you?" Before Sarah could answer, a small voice came from inside the room. "Mommy?" A little boy, no more than 6, peeked out from behind Sarah's legs. He had a mop of messy brown hair and was clutching a well-loved teddy bear. But it was his eyes that made Helen's breath catch in her throat. They were Gerald's eyes. Her late husband's warm, kind hazel eyes. And in their shape she saw Adam. The math, the terrible, heart-stopping math, did in her head. 12 years missing. A 6-year-old boy? Sarah saw the understanding dawn on Helen's face. Her shoulders slumped in defeat. "You'd better come in," she said softly, stepping aside. The hotel room was small and impersonal. Suitcases were open on the floor, clothes neatly folded. A half-eaten pizza sat on the small table. It was the room of someone waiting, not living. Helen stood rigidly in the center of the room, the envelope still clutched in her hand. "Start talking," she said, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Who are you to my son?" Sarah guided the little boy, Henry, back to the bed, handing him a tablet with a cartoon. She then turned to face Helen, wringing her hands. "My name is Sarah Miller. Adam and I, we met in graduate school. We fell in love." "He never told me," Helen interrupted, the pain sharp and fresh. "He wanted to," Sarah said urgently. "He was going to, but then things got complicated." She took a deep, shuddering breath. "His work, Mrs. Rivers. The project he was managing downtown, the high-rise. He found discrepancies. Massive financial fraud. And dangerous people." Helen stared at her, the pieces beginning to click into a horrifying picture. Adam had always been fiercely principled, just like his father. He wouldn't have looked away. "He was gathering evidence," Sarah continued, her voice dropping. "He knew they were onto him. The week before he disappeared, he was terrified. He said if anything happened to him, I was to take this." She pointed to the envelope in Helen's hand. "And go to you. He said you were the strongest person he knew. He said you'd keep us safe." Helen's knees felt weak. She stumbled to the cheap armchair by the window and sank into it. "Keep you safe," she repeated numbly. All those years she thought he was a victim of random crime. But he had been a target. Her boy had been brave, and it had cost him everything. "The letter," Helen managed to say. "It just says she is with you now. It's not even addressed to me." "It was never for you," Sarah whispered, tears finally spilling over. "It was my signal, my proof. He gave it to me the morning I last saw him. He said, 'When you give this to my mother, she will know you are telling the truth. She will know you are with her now. Under her protection. He trusted you with our lives.'" The room was silent except for the soft sounds of the cartoon from the tablet. Henry looked up from the screen, his gaze moving from his crying mother to the distraught stranger in the chair. And then he did something that shattered the last of Helen's defenses. He slid off the bed, walked over to her, and placed his small hand on her knee. "Don't be sad," he said, his voice small and sincere. "Mommy cries about Daddy, too." Helen looked from Henry's earnest, familiar face to Sarah's grief-stricken one. The anger, the betrayal, the years of lonely grief, it all crumbled, replaced by a tidal wave of a new, overwhelming emotion, a fierce, primal need to protect. The phantom of her son had sent them to her. And in this little boy's eyes, she saw not just a ghost, but a future. She reached out a trembling hand and covered Henry's small one with her own, bringing the ghost home. The drive back to Maple. Lane was shrouded in a silence so profound it felt like a third passenger in Helen's sedan. Henry, strapped into the back seat, had fallen asleep almost instantly, his head lolling against the window. the streetlights painting golden stripes across his peaceful face. In the passenger seat, Sarah sat stiffly, her hands clenched in her lap, staring out at the darkened streets of Cedar Brook as if seeing them for the first and last time. Helen's mind raced, a turbulent storm of emotions. The initial shock was receding, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. Dangerous people. Financial fraud. He was gathering evidence. The words played on a loop, reframing 12 years of vague, aching loss into a specific, terrifying narrative. Her son hadn't just vanished. He had been swallowed by a darkness he was trying to expose. And he had entrusted her with its most precious collateral, his family. She pulled into the driveway of the familiar two-story house. The porch light was on, a beacon she'd left burning for a son who would never come home, until tonight. "We're here," Helen said, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears. Sarah nodded silently, unbuckling her seatbelt with fumbling fingers. She gently shook Henry awake. The little boy stirred, blinking confusedly at the unfamiliar house. Helen led them inside. The house seemed to hold its breath as they crossed the threshold. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall sounded louder, more significant. Henry, now awake and curious, looked around the living room with wide eyes, taking in the museum of his father's life. "Is this where Daddy lived?" he asked, his small voice cutting through the heavy silence. Helen's heart clenched. "Yes, sweetheart," she said, her voice softening for the first time. "This is where he grew up." She showed them to the guest room, the same room that had once been Adam's. The blue comforter, the model airplane still suspended. From the ceiling, the faint smell of old books and memories. Sarah's eyes welled up as she took it in. "I can't," she began, her voice breaking. "This is too much. It's exactly where you should be," Helen stated, her tone leaving no room for argument. The maternal instinct, long dormant under layers of grief, was roaring back to life. It was fierce and uncompromising. After settling a drowsy Henry into the bed, Helen turned to Sarah. "The kitchen," she said, "we need to talk." They sat at the old oak table where Helen had shared countless meals with Gerald and Adam. She poured 2 glasses of water, her movements methodical. The initial storm of their meeting had passed. Now came the grim, detailed aftermath. "Start from the beginning," Sarah Helen said, her gaze steady. "Leave nothing out." And so Sarah talked. She spoke of meeting Adam at Stanford, of his brilliant mind and his unwavering moral compass. She described the downtown revitalization project he was so proud to lead, and the slow, dawning horror as he uncovered the truth that the project was a front for money laundering, orchestrated by a network of powerful, ruthless individuals. He kept a diary, Sarah revealed, her voice dropping to a whisper. Not a digital one. He said paper was harder to hack. A small black leather-bound book. He documented everything. Names, account numbers, dates. He called it his insurance policy. Helen listened, her face a mask of grim concentration. "Where is it?" "The last time I saw him," Sarah said, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. "He was terrified. He said he had to hide it somewhere. They'd never look somewhere sentimental." He looked around the kitchen, her eyes landing on the backyard, visible through the window. He talked about this house. He talked about the big oak tree in the backyard. The one he and his dad built a treehouse in. Helen's breath caught. The old oak. Gerald's pride and joy. Adam's childhood fortress. He said he put it in a waterproof box and buried it there, Sarah finished, her confession hanging in the air between them. He said if anything happened, that diary was the only thing that could protect us and bring them to justice. The full weight of Adam's actions settled on Helen's shoulders. He hadn't just left her a family to protect. He had left her a weapon to wield. The ghost of her son was not just in the photographs on the wall or in the memories that haunted this house. It was buried in her own backyard, a silent, ticking bomb of truth. Helen looked at Sarah, this young woman who had loved her son, who had lived in the shadows of his sacrifice, who had raised his child in fear. The last vestiges of resentment evaporated. "You are safe here, Sarah," Helen said, her voice firm and resolute. "Both of you. This is your home now." It was more than an invitation, it was a vow. The waiting was over. The fight was beginning. The weight of the dawn. The first light of dawn was a pale, reluctant smear against the kitchen window when Helen finally stirred from her vigil at the oak table. She hadn't slept. How could she? The ghosts of yesterday had taken up permanent residence in her house. their whispers echoing in the creaks of the floorboards. Their presence solid and undeniable, in the form of a sleeping woman and a small boy in her son's old room. The coffee maker gurgled its completion, the rich, bitter scent doing little to cut through the fog of exhaustion and emotional turmoil. Her hands wrapped around the warm ceramic of Gerald's favorite mug, the one with the cracked handle she'd never gotten around to fixing, were steady, but a violent tempest raged within her. A diary, buried under the oak tree. The words were a mantra, a summons. Her son's voice, silent for 12 years, was now a clear, desperate command from the past. She heard a soft footfall behind her. Sarah stood at the entrance to the kitchen, shrouded in the gray pre-dawn light. She looked younger, more vulnerable without the armor of the day before, her face etched with the same sleepless anxiety. "He didn't want you involved," Sarah began, her voice raspy. She leaned against the doorframe, as if she didn't have the strength to stand on her own. That was his one rule, his one regret. He said dragging you into this would be the ultimate failure. Helen took a slow sip of coffee, the heat a grounding sensation. "He was my son," she said, her voice low but unwavering. "I was involved the moment he was born. His battles are my battles. His secrets," she paused, her gaze drifting toward the backyard, where the silhouette of the massive oak tree was just becoming visible, "are now my secrets." The unspoken question hung between them. What do we do now? It was Henry who broke the tension, padding into the kitchen with his teddy bear dangling from one hand. He blinked sleepily at Helen, then at his mother, his child's radar instantly picking up on the heavy atmosphere. "Grandma," he said, the title slipping out so naturally, so innocently, that it stole the breath from both women. "I'm hungry." The word grandma was a key, turning a lock deep inside Helen's soul. It wasn't just a title. It was a responsibility, an identity she thought she'd lost. She looked at this little boy, this living, breathing piece of her atom, and felt a surge of purpose so strong it eclipsed the fear. "All right, sweetheart," Helen said, her voice softening. She moved to the pantry with a resolve that hadn't been there minutes before. "How about some pancakes? Your father, he loved my pancakes." As she mixed the batter, a mundane ritual in the face of an extraordinary crisis, the plan began to form in her mind. It was vague, shadowy, but its core was solid steel. They would retrieve the diary, they would learn the whole truth, and then they would decide together what to do with it. The kitchen slowly filled with the comforting aroma of frying pancakes and brewing coffee. For a few fleeting moments, it almost felt normal, almost. But the specter of the oak tree loomed just outside the window, a silent sentinel guarding a truth that had the power to shatter their fragile new world, or perhaps to finally make it safe. The unspoken promise. The late afternoon sun cast long, lazy shadows across the porch where Helen and Sarah sat in worn wicker chairs. The remains of a simple lunch sat between them, a silent testament to the new, fragile domesticity they were building. Henry was napping inside, the screen door slightly ajar so they could hear him if he stirred. This was the first moment of true quiet they had shared since Sarah's arrival. The initial storm of revelations had passed, leaving in its wake a landscape of difficult truths and unspoken fears. The air was thick, with the scent of blooming jasmine and the weight of everything yet to be said. Sarah stared into her glass of iced tea, the condensation forming a wet ring on the arm of her chair. "He talked about this porch," she said softly, not looking at Helen. "He said you and his dad would sit out here every evening, that you solved all the world's problems right here on these chairs." A faint, sad smile touched Helen's lips. Gerald always said a porch was the best place for hard conversations. Too much honesty for the inside of a house. It was an invitation. Sarah took a deep, shuddering breath as if steeling herself. "The night before he disappeared," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "he came to my apartment. He was different, calm. It was the calm that comes after a terrible decision has been made." She looked up, her eyes meeting Helen's, pleading for understanding. "He told me he was going to the police the next day. He had a meeting set up with a detective he thought he could trust. He had copies of some of the documents, but the diary was the proof. He said it was the only thing that connected all the dots all the way to the top." Helen listened, her hand still in her lap. She could feel Gerald's presence, then a steady pressure at her back, urging her to be strong. "Why didn't he bring it to you?" "Then," Helen asked, her voice gentle but firm. "He was paranoid," Sarah admitted. He was convinced they were watching his every move, mine too. He said if he was followed to my place or if they searched it, he couldn't risk the diary being found on me. He said burying it here was the only way to keep it and us safe. He knew no one would look for it in his mother's backyard. Her voice broke. He was protecting us until the very end. Tears finally spilled over tracing. Clean paths through the dust of old grief on Helen's cheeks. They weren't tears of weakness, but of a profound, aching pride for the man her son had become, a man who, facing a monster, had thought first of shielding his family. He was right to send you to me, Helen said, her voice gaining a new steely quality. She leaned forward, her gaze intense. This isn't just about the past anymore, Sarah. It's about Henry's future. His safety. This burden Adam left us, it's also our weapon. Sarah looked at her, a flicker of the same resolve igniting in her own eyes. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now joined by something else, a spark of hope. What are we going to do, Helen? Helen's eyes drifted to the mighty oak tree, its leaves rustling softly in the breeze. It stood as a monument to a happy childhood, now the keeper of a dark adult secret. We are going to wait for the right moment, Helen said, her voice low and decisive. We are going to be smarter than they are. We will get the diary, and then we will finish what my son started. She reached across the space between them and placed her hand over Sarah's. It wasn't just a gesture of comfort. It was a pact, a vow made between a mother and the wife of her son, on a porch that had seen generations of love and struggle. The silence that fell between them now was different. It was no longer heavy with dread, but charged with a shared, unbreakable purpose. The ghosts were still there, but they were no longer haunting them. They were standing with them shoulder to shoulder, ready for the fight. The perfect night arrived cloaked in a deep, moonless black. A soft drizzle had fallen since sunset, dampening the earth and muffling all sound. Inside the house on Maple Lane, every creak of the floorboards sounded like a thunderclap. Henry was asleep, his soft, even breaths a counterpoint to the frantic beating of Sarah's heart. Helen moved with a quiet purpose that belied her age. From the garage, she retrieved a small, sturdy garden trowel and a heavy-duty flashlight. She met Sarah in the kitchen. No words were needed. A single grim nod passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the line they were about to cross. They slipped out the back door, the cool, wet air a shock against their skin. The world was reduced to the small circle of light from Helen's flashlight, illuminating the glistening grass underfoot. The great oak tree stood ahead of them, a dark, hulking giant against the starless sky, its branches like skeletal fingers reaching for the heavens. He said it was on the north side, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling slightly. About 3 feet out from the trunk, buried near the big root that surfaces. Helen swept the beam of light across the base of the tree. There it was, a thick, gnarled root that emerged from the soil like the backbone of some ancient creature before diving back down. It was exactly as Adam had described. Helen handed the flashlight to Sarah. Keep watch. Her voice was calm, but Sarah could see the tremor in her hands as she gripped the trowel. This wasn't just digging for an object. It was an excavation of her son's final days, a physical connection to his last desperate act. The damp earth gave way easily. The soft thud of the metal slicing into the soil, the scrape against small stones, each sound was amplified in the tense silence. Helen worked with a fierce, focused energy, her breaths coming in short, white puffs in the chilly air. With each scoop of earth, she was digging toward the truth, toward the ghost of her boy. Sarah's eyes darted between the dark outlines of the neighboring houses and Helen's laboring form. Every distant car engine, every rustle of leaves made her jump. She felt exposed, a silhouette against the lit kitchen window, performing a clandestine ritual under the cover of night. Then the trowel struck something hard. Not a rock. Something with a dull metallic clink. Helen froze. Her eyes met Sarah's over the beam of the flashlight. A shared, breathless moment of anticipation and dread. She dropped the trowel and used her hands, scraping away the wet, cold soil with her bare fingers. Her nails dug into the earth, clawing at the past. And there it was. A small military-grade waterproof lockbox coated in black rubber. It was no bigger than a thick hardcover book, but it felt in that moment as heavy as a tombstone. Helen lifted it from its earthy grave. It was cold and slick with mud. She cradled it in her lap, sitting back on her heels, staring at it. This was it. The sum of all her fears, the reason for her years of loneliness. The answer to the question that had haunted her for 12 long years. It was here in her hands. Sarah knelt beside her, her hand coming to rest on Helen's shoulder. They stayed like that for a long moment. Two women bound together by love, loss, and a small, locked box that held the power to change everything. The past was no longer buried. It was in their hands. And the weight of it was terrifying. The lockbox sat on the kitchen table between them, an inert, dark object that seemed to suck all the light and sound from the room. The mud had been wiped away, revealing its stark utilitarian design. Henry was still asleep, the profound, untroubled sleep of the innocent, a stark contrast to the storm of emotion brewing in the kitchen. Sarah had found the key, taped to the back of Adam's old college photograph in her wallet, a small, silver key she had carried for 12 years without fully knowing why. Her hands shook so badly she could barely hold it steady. "Here," Helen said, her voice surprisingly calm. She covered Sarah's trembling hand with her own steady one, guiding the key toward the lock. It was a gesture of shared burden, of united front. The click of the lock disengaging was deafening in the silent kitchen. Sarah lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in a layer of vacuum-sealed plastic, was a simple black leather-bound journal. Next to it lay a sealed envelope with "Mom" written on it in Adam's familiar handwriting. Seeing that single word, written just for her, was a physical blow to Helen. She had to grip the edge of the table to steady herself. Sarah carefully lifted out the diary, handling it as if it were a holy relic. She broke the seal on the plastic and opened the cover. Adam's precise architectural script filled the pages. Dates, times, names, amounts. It was a meticulous record of a conspiracy. A map of corruption that led to people with powerful, recognizable names. But it was the final entry, dated the day he disappeared, that made the blood drain from Sarah's face. She read it aloud, her voice a hollow whisper, each word dropping like a stone into the quiet room. "I've set the meeting with Miller for 10 a.m. tomorrow. I pray he's the honest man he claims to be. I've hidden the master file. They can't find it. If you're reading this, Sarah, my love, then I was right to be afraid. Tell my mother I'm so sorry. Tell her I never wanted this shadow to fall over her life. Tell Henry stories about me. Make sure he knows I loved him more than life itself. The truth is all that's left now. The names are all here. Don't trust anyone." He had known. With a chilling clarity, he had known he was walking into a trap. A raw, guttural sound escaped Helen, a mother's anguish, long suppressed, finally breaking free. She sank into a chair, the weight of his foresight, his courage, and his sacrifice crushing her. Then she picked up the envelope addressed to her. With trembling fingers, she tore it open. It contained a single sheet of paper. "Mom, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And I'm so sorry. Sorry for the pain, for the questions, for the silence. Please know, none of this was your fault. You and Dad taught me to stand for what's right, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Take care of Sarah and my son. They are my heart living outside my body. They need you. Be the fortress I know you are. I love you always. Adam." Tears streamed down Helen's face, no longer of grief, but of a devastating, proud love. He hadn't been a victim. He had been a warrior, and his final battle had been to protect them. Sarah was crying too, her head bowed over the diary. The names... Helen, these people, they're everywhere. In city government and development firms. Helen wiped her tears with the back of her hand. The sorrow was being burned away, replaced by a cold, sharp fury. She looked at the diary, then at the photo of a smiling Adam on the wall. "They took my son," she said, her voice low and vibrating with a new, terrifying resolve. "They thought they could bury the truth with him." She reached out and closed the diary, her hand resting protectively on its cover. But they didn't count on his mother. The diary lay between them on the coffee table, no longer just a collection of pages, but a living, breathing entity that had reshaped their world. The initial storm of grief and shock had passed, leaving in its wake a hard diamond-core resolve. They were no longer just a grieving mother and a widowed wife, they were allies, co-conspirators in a war they hadn't chosen but were now determined to win. "We need a lawyer," Helen said, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. It wasn't a question but a statement of fact, not just any lawyer. Someone who specializes in this kind of thing, whistleblower protection. Someone beyond reach. Sarah, her face still pale but her eyes clear and focused, nodded. Adam mentioned someone once. A former federal prosecutor, Helen Roberts. He said if things ever went sideways, Roberts was the only one he'd trust. He's in private practice now in the city? Then that's where we start, Helen replied. She moved to the old wooden desk that had been Gerald's, a piece of furniture that had witnessed a lifetime of bills and birthday cards, and now a conspiracy. She pulled out a sleek new burner phone. It's plastic. Shell, a stark contrast to the worm-worn wood. No more calls on our personal lines. From now on, we assume they could be listening. This was the new reality. Paranoia was no longer a symptom. It was a survival strategy. Helen placed the call to Alan Roberts' office. Her voice was calm, measured, and laced with an authority that brooked no refusal. She didn't reveal details over the phone, only that it pertained to the Adam Rivers case and involved matters of national security. She used the words her son had written in his diary, the names of the powerful, as a key to unlock immediate attention. An appointment was set for the following morning. That night, Helen didn't sleep in her bedroom. She sat in the armchair in the living room, all the diary and the burner phone on the side table, a silent sentinel. The house, once a museum of loss, had transformed into a command center. The ghosts were still there, but they were no longer wailing. They were standing guard. Down the hall, Sarah lay awake in the old bedroom. Henry curled against her side. She could hear the faint, steady tick of the grandfather clock from the living room, a sound that had once symbolized endless waiting but now marked the countdown to a confrontation. She looked at her son's peaceful face and made a silent vow to the man she loved and the mother who had become her general. We will be safe. We will be free. The first light of dawn found Helen in the same position, her eyes tired but burning with a fire that had been absent for 12 years. She wasn't just Helen Rivers, the retired schoolteacher, the widow. She was Helen Rivers, the mother of Adam Rivers, and she was ready to face the dragons he had dared to slay. She looked at the photograph of Adam on the mantelpiece, his smile forever young, forever brave. "It's time, my boy," she whispered into the quiet room. "It's time to finish your fight." Alan Roberts' office was exactly as Adam had described, a fortress of polished mahogany and legal volumes, smelling of old books, strong coffee, and unassailable authority. He was a man in his late 50s with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a handshake that felt like a pact. For 2 hours, Helen and Sarah laid out their evidence. The diary, with its damning entries, was placed before him like a sacred offering. Alan read in silence, his expression growing graver with each turned page. When he finished, he removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. "This is explosive," he said finally, his voice low and serious. "The names in here. This goes to the highest levels of the city's power structure. Adam was right to be afraid, and he was right to protect this with his life." He looked from Helen's resolute face to Sarah's anxious one. "What he did was incredibly brave. What you're doing now is even braver." Under Alan's meticulous guidance, a multi-layered strategy was forged. Copies of the diary were digitally secured in encrypted cloud vaults, with dead man switches set to release the information to major news outlets if anything happened to them. Alan would act as their shield, using his connections to approach the right people in the FBI, bypassing the corrupted local channels Adam had distrusted. The weeks that followed were a tense blur of quiet meetings, legal procedures, and waiting. The house on Maple Lane became their bunker, but it was no longer a place of mourning. It was filled with a new, purposeful energy. Henry's laughter, once a rare and tentative sound, now echoed through the halls as he and Helen baked cookies together, his small hands carefully placing chocolate chips on the dough. Sarah started working remotely for a design firm, her talent slowly reawakening in the safety of this new haven. Helen was no longer just waiting. She was living. She was a grandmother, reading bedtime stories, attending parent-teacher conferences with Sarah, and building a life she never thought she'd have. The break in the case came not with a dramatic arrest on the evening news, but with a quiet phone call from Alan. "It's done," he said, his voice thick with emotion and exhaustion. "The federal warrants were executed this morning. It's all over the news now." Helen turned on the television. There, on the screen, were the faces from Adam's diary. Powerful, smug faces she had seen at charity galas and in business magazines being perp-walked into federal buildings. The Chiron read, "Major corruption sting rocks City Hall." There were no cheers, no triumphant cries, only a profound echoing silence. Sarah reached for Helen's hand, and they stood together watching, the screen, their tears falling. Not in grief, but in vindication, Adam's name was being cleared. His truth was finally being told. That evening, they sat on the porch, Helen, Sarah, and Henry, who was swinging contentedly on the porch swing. The air was sweet with the scent of jasmine and cut grass. The same porch where a lost mother had once sat alone, with her ghosts, was now filled with the vibrant, living proof of her son's love. Henry looked up from his coloring book. "Grandma," he said, "tell me the story about Daddy in the treehouse again." Helen smiled, a real, unburdened smile that reached her eyes. She began the story, her voice warm and steady. As she spoke, she realized the sound she was listening for, the one she had been missing for 12 years, wasn't the sound of her son's voice. It was the sound of a new heartbeat, the rhythm of a family, broken and remade, stronger at the broken places. The past was finally at peace. The future was just beginning,